These men are different, set apart from other human beings. They have sworn to accept their deaths unconditionally whenever orders or circumstances demand it. And they have taken that oath, given that promise, in the name of the rest of us. They have offered to spare us the horror of confronting the face of battle. War can show a face of glory to the world. No spectacle so touches the emotions as the sight of soldiers arrayed for ceremony. A column of young men in fine uniform turns heads and stirs hearts. Whether they parade to bury a hero, celebrate a victory, or, as on this day, state their readiness to die in the terrible environment of a battlefield. Just south of Brussels is the battlefield of Waterloo. It's an appropriate place from which to observe the changing face of battle. For here, battlefields, ancient and modern, overlap each other like scales of armor. 50 miles northwest lies the sea. 50 miles southeast are the steep, wooded hills of the Ardennes. Waterloo stands astride the corridor in between, a natural invasion route for armies of all ages. At its center rises the Lion Mound, Belgium's monument to the Allied victory, and a unique place to look back at the experience of battle. Some miles to the south of me, over there, more than 2,000 years ago, Caesar and his Roman legions fought the Nervii on the banks of the Sambre. Further to the west were the battlefields of Agincourt and Crécy, where English archers cut down the flower of French chivalry in the 14th and 15th centuries. And not far to the east lies Ramillies, where Marlborough and his cavalry won a famous victory 100 years before Waterloo. And 100 years after Waterloo, it was the German army of von Kluck that passed this way, bound for the mud and trenches of Flanders. In the early days of May 1940, from here, you could very well have heard the rumble of the tanks of the 3rd Panzer Division, the northern flank of the German advance that introduced to a startled world the revolutionary concept of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. So this Lion Mound is a military vantage point in more than one way. In this program, we can view the actions that took place at different stages throughout the course of that eventful day and compare them directly with the equivalent experience of other battles in other centuries. For war does change, even if the human emotions it touches remain constant and universal. June the 18th, 1815, Napoleon, on the morning of Waterloo, reviewed his army from the ridge which runs opposite the Lion Mound. While Napoleon showed himself to his soldiers, Wellington's men were marching to the ridge on the other side of the valley. Men become soldiers for all sorts of reasons. Roman soldiers served mainly for pay. The word soldier comes from the name of the coin they received. The Muslim soldiers of the caliphs of Islam were enlisted as slaves of the state. At the start of America's Civil War, the North relied on volunteers. Tommies of the British Empire soldiered for a shilling a day. Kitchener's armies went to the First World War for patriotism and comradeship. The French went because they owed that duty to the Republic. The Germans marched to the Second World War in obedience to the will of the Führer. For the average American conscript who fought the Germans and the Japanese, the aim was to get the job done and get back home. And the British regulars who went to the Falklands were also doing their job as highly trained professionals. Dawn at Waterloo, and soldiers on both sides waited with mixed feelings for the impending battle. One 16-year-old British infantry officer, George Keppel, spent what he called the dreary interval between daylight and the first cannon shot, constantly wishing that the fight was fought. The urge to have it over and done with seems to afflict all soldiers on the eve of battle. Fear gnaws at them. Fear of death, of wounds, of showing fear to their comrades. Men draw close, compulsively cleaning their weapons and trying to keep at bay that silence that falls on each little group.
You get that waiting, that fear, not fear in itself, but fear of being frightened. You are waiting for something to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. In yourself, you're waiting. You think, am I going to be frightened? It goes through your mind. I don't want to be frightened, because if anything goes wrong and I'm scared, I might let my mates down.
I was particularly nervy. I'd clean my gun, go off to the toilet, have a meal, have a pick out of a bully beef tin that I didn't really want. But once I was committed, I was a totally different fella. I could carry on then. Once I got moving, I was good. But the night before, no good at all.
I went from acute fear the day I got off the plane that landed there to chronic fear that stayed with me the entire time I was there. Acute fear is when you feel like someone's going to take your life right away, and you're absolutely like this, ready to respond, and chronic fear becomes kind of a knot in the pit of your stomach. It's there all the time. It never quite ever goes away.
It's common language. You get butterflies, you know. They've been working overtime. Even with the you carry a parachute on your back, you don't know what will happen. Will it open? Will you arrive safely down? But as soon as the plane left the ground, it was calm then, yeah. But the men never calmed down, because they did. Now, once that door is open, as the green light comes on, once the order came, stand up. Well, I mean, it was a feeling like either you fill your pants or you jump out.
But part of that fear is the physical fear of being hit, actually downed, and part of it is failing. And the two sort of balance against each other and help you go on. So prior to it, you're aware of it. I mean, we stood together prior to moving round to the battle in a group, and we all stood close and sort of mumbled together and sort of got confidence. And that was fear. But there was also anticipation. You know, it's the one thing we'd all trained for. No one would have not wanted to be there, but nobody really wanted to be there, so it was very mixed feelings.
Got to get it done fast, so the only way to do it is get in there.
It's just waiting around is the worst part. We're all just waiting to go. So we just want to get there and get over and done with.
It was like going to a picnic. Everyone was happy. It was really amazing that it wasn't like going into a battle at the time, until the first shots were fired across the bow of our ships. Then the picnic was no longer there. Then came the war.
The main action at Waterloo opened with an artillery bombardment, when Napoleon's grand battery of 80 guns fired for over half an hour across the valley separating the two armies, and the British artillery replied. Probably more than 2,000 rounds of ammunition were fired in that interval by guns like this one. This happens to be British. It's a bronze 6-pounder, meaning that its solid shot weighed 6 pounds. But it also fired loose shot, canister or grape like this, which was designed to have the same effect upon massed infantry as a shotgun cartridge on a flock of birds. To aim, the number one would simply squint down the barrel. If he wanted to raise or lower, elevate or depress, he could use this. But if he wanted to traverse, he simply used raw muscle. He picked up the handspike and he pushed and shoved until he was happy. Now, the range of this light 6-pounder would have been up to 1,200 yards, and the French heavier 12-pounders across the valley up to a mile. At long range, and that's what it was, they'd have been using this, solid shot, and using it with horrific effect. During the central stage of the battle, the Inniskilling Regiment was kept under direct fire by the French artillery at a range of 700 yards for 4 hours. When it marched off, it left 450 of its 750 officers and men dead or wounded in the positions. Ensign Leake of the 52nd Regiment actually saw the ball leave the muzzle of a French gun after its crew had swabbed, loaded and rammed, and he watched it come apparently straight at his face. Well, he debated whether he should duck and decided that honor forbade that, so he drew himself to attention, while the ball took off the heads of the 4 men next to him. No wonder the infantry feared and hated artillery. It was already the great killer of the battlefield. As one war followed another during the century after Waterloo, artillery grew in power and impact. During the American Civil War, it was the terrible guns the survivors of battle recalled. "I was never so tired of shelling in my life," wrote one veteran. "I hate cannon." And now artillery began to destroy townscapes as well. In the battle with the rebellious Paris communards of 1871, the government guns tore down street after street, transforming the center of the French capital into a field of ruins, leaving us with images we might well associate with the devastation of the bombing of World War II. But it was during the First World War that artillery revealed its newfound power. A century of invention had turned Wellington's smooth-bore cannon into engines of mass destruction of every size. From the small field guns, like the British 18-pounder, and its French equivalent, the 75mm, which fired 20 rounds a minute, to the massive railway guns that could reach miles into the enemy's positions. Guns like these made the First World War truly an artillery war. The great trench offensives were preceded by bombardments of unparalleled weight and intensity. Before the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, 4.25 million shells were fired over 19 days. Even delivering such bombardments was an experience no gunners could ever forget.
I don't think I have ever known anything as impressive as the opening of a really full-scale barrage. Suddenly, bang on 0 hour, the whole place just comes alive with a terrific surge with all the shells that are traveling through the air, and away on the skyline, as far as the eye can see, right and left, is absolutely lit up with pinpoints. A most impressive sight.
Yet the gun crews rarely saw what their shells hit. It was the forward observers who witnessed the fall of shot.
I remember when we were firing our 8-inch howitzers from Albert, and there's a village called Earls, which was more or less intact behind the German lines. It distressed me enormously because it's a very pretty little village with houses on both sides of the road, and I only had to fire 4 rounds, 1, 2, 3, 4, to see the spire of the church collapse and the whole of the village flattened out, 4 rounds only from our 8-inch howitzers.
It was artillery that was the great killer of the First World War. It was also the great demoralizer. Soldiers of all nations loathed shellfire's arbitrary and impersonal character. A young British officer wrote, "Terror and death, coming from far away, seemed much more ghastly than a hail of fire from people we could see and with whom we could come to grips."
It was a fatalistic situation. Imagine terrible weather, the ground outside turned to an impossible morass, and the din, the noise and the concussion just making the air vibrate. You really felt, well, there's nothing we can do to escape. It's a question of time before your number's on the bit that comes along.
Artillery did not only destroy men, it also devastated the surface of the battlefield on which they moved and tried to survive. It turned farms and villages to heaps of shapeless rubble, fields to wasteland, forests to tangled heaps of brushwood. Above all, it turned the soil into mud, mud so deep and liquid that it swallowed horses and drowned men. This gentle slope is the rise that leads to Passchendaele, the tiny village outside Ypres, so long and savagely contested that its name has come to stand for the Holocaust of the First World War. This is how it looks today, and as it must have looked in 1914. But in the autumn of 1917, it had come to resemble the surface of the moon. This sequence of aerial photographs record how, as crater came to overlap crater during the relentless bombardment, houses, hedges, even field boundaries were progressively erased, until Passchendaele existed only as a name on a map, a terrible tribute to the power that artillery exerts on the modern battlefield. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Waterloo had been raging for 2 hours. It was at its fiercest here around Hougoumont, the old fortified manor house and farm standing just in front of the British right wing. Wellington had occupied it and loopholed it for defense. It's still an impressive building today. In 1815, it was even stronger and more extensive enough to contain nearly 2 battalions of British foot guards. Wellington had garrisoned it strongly because he thought its possession essential to secure his right wing. The French were equally keen to take it from him. Indeed, they opened the battle by an attack on Hougoumont, and the fight there quickly became a battle within a battle, persisting throughout the morning and afternoon. At one stage, the French actually broke into the central courtyard, but by sheer weight of numbers, the British were able to force the gate shut behind them. The intruders were then hunted down and every single one of them killed, except a young drummer boy. Around the middle of the day, some of the buildings here were set on fire by shells from French howitzers, and this introduced another dimension of horror to the fighting in the farm. The roofs of the barn and the manor crashed in a sheet of flame on top of the wounded who were lying inside, and many of them were burnt to death. The whole of this courtyard was like an oven. Everyone was scorched by flying embers. The old manor house, which used to stand over there, burnt down in the end, and all that's left is this little chapel. But in spite of all this, and despite the ferocity and courage of the French attack, the walls of this courtyard were never breached. The wood outside was lost, the buildings often completely surrounded, but at the end of the battle, the foot guards were standing firm. Throughout history, it has always been a hard and bloody task to capture a fortified position from resolute defenders. To capture Malta in 1565, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman sent a mighty armada of 181 ships and an army of 30,000 men. The island was defended by 700 Knights of St. John and 9,000 hired soldiers. Yet 4 months later, the Turks, who had lost 2/3 of their men in the siege, retired in ignominious defeat to Constantinople. 400 years later, American Marines were brought in to recapture the city of Hue, Vietnam's ancient capital, seized by the North Vietnamese army in their Tet offensive. In the heart of the city lies its citadel, built by French colonial engineers in the 19th century and designed only to withstand gunpowder and round shot. A Against it, the Americans deployed all the firepower of a mighty modern army. Despite these ferocious assaults, the defenders held out for 25 days behind the citadel's walls and moat, until in the end it was carried by the oldest of methods, direct assault by infantrymen.
Where I'd been over there 4 months, and we were always in the rice paddies, in the jungles, patrols, something like that. This was something new. It's like broke into like any city, blocks, concrete buildings. And the thing was, you never know what was going to happen every time you turned a corner or every time you entered a building. We got in the habit of throwing grenades and firing first before we went anywhere. And in some incidents, it was no more than 5 feet that you had to shoot the enemy. He was trying to shoot you. This went on building by building. We had to take it. There was no such thing as trying to clear a block out, you know, just with a platoon. We broke down to 5-man teams. It was just chaos, you know. Just whoever shot fastest made it, in which quite a few did make it on our side, you know. Our job was to take the citadel. I can remember a huge wall around it. Most of the city was taken at the time, but the citadel was left. I would say half of the company had serious enough wounds. The final count of men that were killed in my platoon were 5 out of my platoon alone. And I think out of our company, I believe it was 15.
The citadel finally fell, but the defenders had already slipped away. By early afternoon at Waterloo, it was now the turn of the massed ranks of infantry to go into action. Wellington's men awaited their attack, lying down in the dead ground behind the crest of the ridge or crouching behind hedge banks, muskets at the ready, until the French columns came within range.
Most of the infantry carried muskets like this. Now this is a Brown Bess. A soldier had to stand up to put powder and ball down the barrel and then ram them home with this. So he usually fired standing, and a well-trained soldier could fire 2 shots a minute. But it was not an accurate weapon. If its heavy lead ball hit home, it was deadly. But you'd be lucky to hit a man over 70 yards away. So it was really only useful against large targets.
The French infantry who made the first attack presented just such a target. They advanced across the valley in massed battalion columns, 25 men deep and 200 wide.
They halted 40 yards down this slope and began to deploy into line. At this point, the British infantry, 4 Scottish regiments, discharged their muskets, taking the French by surprise. They then fixed bayonets and burst through the hedge.
Here on the ridge, 8,000 or 9,000 English and French fought a violent hand-to-hand battle. The French, impeded by the press of their own numbers, soon broke and fled, and were chased back across the valley by the Scots dragoons to the cry of "Scotland forever." The experience of battle for the infantrymen had altered very little in the centuries before Waterloo. For the Persians, who fought the Lydians at Sardis in 546 BC, combat took a form which would have been familiar to Julius Caesar or Frederick the Great of Prussia. Once the two sides made contact, it was a business of push and shove with edged weapons. The fight was always short because the muscular effort required was too exhausting to be sustained for long. Gunpowder scarcely varied the essential nature of the foot soldier's experience. He now had to endure cannon and musket shot instead of the arrow cloud. But since black powder weapons were so inaccurate, he still had to close with the enemy to deliver a decision. So, after the opening exchange of projectiles, it was hand-to-hand combat that decided who gave way and who won the day. What did change the infantryman's experience of battle, and change it catastrophically, was the appearance of quick-firing artillery. The range and accuracy of the rifle, and the inescapable blanket fire of the machine gun. Disastrously, no army had appreciated by the outbreak of the Great War their impact on massed infantry formations. The British soldiers who left their trenches on the first day of the Somme walked into a scythe of machine gun fire. A survivor remembered, by the time I'd gone 10 yards, there seemed to be only a few men left around me. By the time I'd gone 20 yards, I seemed to be on my own. And then I was hit myself.
Everybody would wonder who's going to get killed. How many of us will come back? I'd rather get killed than get badly wounded and lie out there and die. And the 1,001 things, trying to picture how your mother and dad'd take it when the telegram arrives to say the Secretary of State regrets to inform you so and so and so and so.
They came over, not in extended order like we advanced, but they came over en masse, just like a crowd coming out of a football match. And it wasn't a matter of aiming, it was just a matter of loading and pulling the trigger.
60,000 soldiers were hit on that July morning. 20,000 died. The disaster the infantrymen suffered on the Somme introduced a new experience for men on the battlefield. When not attacking, they found shelter below ground. When they did attack, they did so in single file to present as small a target as possible. In the years since 1918, the infantryman has had to fight to survive on every sort of battlefield. He has sweated through the jungles and rainforests of Southeast Asia. He's stormed through the deserts of North Africa. He's suffered on the exposed beaches of the Pacific Islands. He's endured the unforgiving snows of the Russian steppe. He's struggled in the mountains of Italy and the Balkans. He's battled through the hedgerows of Northern Europe. But despite today's technology, he still remains essentially a foot soldier.
All of a sudden, you're the most important man. You're as good as any fighter pilot or all the other guys. You're at the front, and everyone's doing what you want to do. And that's a good feeling, apart from the fact that you are at the front. Unlike everybody else, what you're going to fight with is you and a gun, which they give you. And everything else you carry on your back. And you're always cold, you're always wet, you're always frightened, and you're always completely shattered all the time. You're never comfortable. And then you have to beat all of those things to do the thing that they want you to do, which is to go in and smack the enemy down hard and finish the job. You can bombard it, you can fire at it from aircraft, you can do everything to the target. But the only time you win is to have us lot, the grunts of the world, standing there saying this is now our piece of real estate. All the technology is great, but there's nothing that can really help us do that last final 400 meters to finish the job.
By the afternoon of Waterloo, Wellington knew that he had a full-scale battle on his hands, and that its outcome rested on his powers of command.
In one important sense, Waterloo resembled every other battle from the earliest times to the end of the 19th century. The commander could see the whole battlefield, or most of it anyway, from one spot, and he could deliver his orders to his subordinates without delay. But in fact, Wellington was rarely in one spot for long. He was constantly in motion, riding always to where danger threatened worst, sometimes even sitting out the charges in the middle of one of his infantry squares. He could ride from the center of the line to the right flank in about 10 minutes. And despite the massive amount of smoke that covered the battlefield, he was able to keep much of it directly in view. If he saw something that needed attention, but he could not go himself, he would hastily write his orders on slips of parchment like this and dispatch them by messenger.
Today, orders flow from the point of command by means undreamt of in Wellington's century. And the information on which orders are based flows into the point of command in a profusion with which no single human being can deal. A modern military headquarters can cover a continent, and its field of action is the world. Here at North American Air Defense Headquarters, they keep watch for signs of missile attack on the United States. They receive their intelligence from radar, reconnaissance satellite, and seabed sound surveillance. This unending stream of facts is processed by the banks of computers and the results displayed on screens. It's on these electronic messages that today's commanders must base their decisions. By mid-afternoon at Waterloo, the French had tried both artillery and infantry against the Allied line. It still refused to break. So at about 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney, Napoleon's battlefield commander, decided to commit his cavalry. Soon, an immense mass of horsemen could be seen approaching from beyond La Belle Alliance, that white building in the distance behind me. The dense columns of cavalry, 12 ranks deep, 500 men abreast, advanced up this slope, watched in awestruck silence by the British they were about to assault. It was a spectacle scarcely ever to be seen again. A sea of steel and horseflesh and brilliant uniforms flowing in waves across the folds of the valley.
But the most unexpected thing about the attack was that it was cavalry alone. There were no French foot soldiers to be seen. Yet against cavalry, infantry had an almost impregnable defense, to form squares. As long as the British infantry kept steady, properly formed and cool enough to continue firing, they were unbreakable.
So as the French cavalry came over the ridge at a canter, they were cut down by grape shot from the British artillery batteries and musket fire from the squares. Time and again they attacked, charging up the slope, round and past the squares, then retreating down the hill, where they reformed to charge again. Soon the ridge around the British line was so covered with the dead and wounded men and horses that the cavalry could no longer ride over it. 12 times the French charged, but when, after an hour and a half, they finally withdrew, the British squares still stood unbroken. Ceremony is the only duty that remains to the surviving mounted regiments. The role they once played strikes the onlooker as utterly archaic, but in their great days it was crucial. The mounted scout found the enemy. The skirmisher kept him in play while the general assembled his forces. And at the crisis of battle, the shock regiments destroyed him. Find, fix, destroy. These functions were and remain essential. Today, they are performed by the tank. The tank was an invention made necessary by the stalemate of the First World War, but one so primitive that it achieved little. By 1940, however, tanks were transformed, and with them came a new form of war, blitzkrieg. Its impact was shattering, demoralizing those it did not destroy.
We came through Holland, Belgium, France, but as soon as we crossed the Belgian border near Arras, the roads, absolutely day and night, been chock-a-block with people running away, leaving everything behind, leaving the home, and as soon as they saw convoys coming, everybody shut because the people been frightened.
It was not only the civilian victims of blitzkrieg who found the appearance of tanks terrifying.
All of a sudden we realized they were enemy tanks. And I said, my God, this is it. What can you do against a tank? They have machine guns. They can run over you. That's the thing you think about more than anything else, is a tank running over your body. There was no place to go. Absolutely no place. I felt like an ant on top of a billiard table.
On the billiard table of the Sinai Desert, Israeli tank soldiers have twice waded to blitzkrieg, experiencing something of the exhilaration felt by European tank crews in World War II.
Racing across the Sinai in '67, I was 22 years old, and in 4 days we got from Gaza Strip to the Suez Canal banks, fighting, moving, all the time on the move, It was a feeling of great power and great energy being released in 4 days.
Power and energy in 20th century warfare are most completely embodied in the aircraft. It takes many military forms. As a strategic bomber, it has been used to wage war on its own against the cities and factories of the enemy. The soldier on the battlefield knows it better as a weapon of ground attack and of tactical bombardment against fortified places. The controversial bombing of Monte Cassino, the Italian fortress monastery, demonstrates the aircraft's awesome destructive power and the terrible effect it has on soldiers trapped in a bombardment.
One morning, we just saw silverfishes there, airplanes, shining in the air. But then all of a sudden somebody shouted, "Got a bloody bomb door open." You could see them as doors you open, We realized them, they after us. Actually, you think that's the last moment we're still alive. It was terrible. We had bombs explode only about 5-6 yards away from mine. The blast lifted you actually off the ground and dropped down again. You hate the shops up there. Doesn't matter what nationality is. If it was our own planes, we would have called them bloody bastards in plain English. I shouldn't say that now, but you hated them. At that moment, you can't hit back. You just crept in the hole like a frightened rat. The whole hill, it was just like rubble. It stunk, it smoked, you smelled gunpowder, and screaming soldiers, partly wounded or wounded. But you didn't dare, when you had a nice cover, you didn't dare to creep out to save your comrade, because that means your own life again, Many men, they've been left behind, but I was lucky I got out.
Since the Second World War, another enemy of the foot soldier has taken to the skies, the attack helicopter. Many military helicopters perform workaday roles, reconnaissance or transportation. In Vietnam, the gunship helicopter proved that it could be used as a weapon of pinpoint attack on the battlefield, with devastating effect.
A lot of people think that because helicopters are up in the air that you don't get a real first-hand view of what you're doing and who you're killing. That's not true, especially when you're flying low level. When you're flying at treetop level and you've got an M60 stuck out the side of the helicopter and somebody fires on you, you're no more than 10 feet from him. You see his head splatter or whatever you may have hit. You see it pretty well firsthand. You get an idea of the gruesomeness of what killing is. And again, it never bothered me because I knew I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And if you let it bother you, you'd have big head problems. The thrill of flying the helicopter and getting it to do what it was capable of doing and winning, obviously you were taking fire, you were getting hits, you may have to take a couple of hits in the aircraft, but at the end you were the one that won. Absolutely, it was very exhilarating.
At about 7 o'clock in the evening of June the 18th, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo approached what has been called its crisis. Napoleon had exhausted all normal means to break the British line. All had failed. He therefore decided to launch the only reserve force he had left, never before committed to action in battle, the Imperial Guard. Powell, an officer of the 1st Foot Guards, describes the result. The French, he said, came on at the double, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" They continued to advance until within 50 or 60 paces of our front, when the brigade was ordered to stand up. Whether it was from this sudden and unexpected appearance so near them, which must have seemed us starting out of the ground, or the tremendously heavy fire we threw into them, La Garde, who had never before failed, suddenly stopped. Those from a distance and more on the flank who could see the affair tell us that the effect of our fire seemed to force the head of the column bodily back. The Imperial Guard retreated, and with it, the rest of the French army.
With the fighting over, it was time to count the cost. About 40,000 of the 120,000 present had been killed or wounded, and 10,000 horses. The wounded were to be pitied more than the dead. As darkness fell, the battlefield was filled with shrieks and groans of those too hurt to move.
Many thousands would lie out on the battlefield throughout the night of Waterloo, some throughout the following day. A few lay uncollected and untended for 2 days and 3 nights and still lived. But the majority of those left so long died of shock, loss of blood, or dehydration. All the wounded men were tormented by thirst, as well as the pain of their injuries. In their agony, they faced yet another threat, death at the hands of looters, military as well as civilian, who crept among the stricken during the hours of darkness to strip them of their valuables and to kill those who resisted. Even if the wounded survived abandonment on the battlefield and the ordeal of evacuation from it, they still had to undergo the torture of primitive surgery at the hands of their medical officers, surgery without anesthetics or antiseptics. In some regiments, as many soldiers died in hospital as had been killed on the field. No wonder, as Wellington rode back in the moonlight through the devastation of the battlefield, those who saw him glimpsed no hint of a victor's jubilation in his face. A victory, he said afterwards, is the greatest tragedy in the world, except a defeat. The wounded soldier of the 20th century has all the advantages of improving medicine. But as if by some process of satanic compensation, the wounds he risks may be far more ghastly than those commonly inflicted by sword or musket. Wounds and death still remain the price soldiers pay for taking part in battle.
I think everyone's afraid of dying. Naturally, whenever you're going to face going off to war, you're going to be fearful of that. I don't think I really dealt so much with that fear of dying as I had troubles in dealing with first being wounded. Okay, I was afraid of being wounded and even made a off-the-cuff comment a few times that if I lost so much as a fingernail, I didn't want to come home. Well, I lost just a little more than a fingernail, and I'm here, and I've accepted it. But I think the thing that I feared more than death and being wounded in Vietnam was being captured and taken as a prisoner.
Capture is fraught with uncertainty. These men suffered that ordeal at the hands of the Japanese. The joy of their liberation cannot mask their years of mistreatment.
It was an incredible parade, because every man there wanted to show that he was still a soldier. Some were bent over on sticks, some were like elephants with beriberi. We all had dysentery. Our feet were 2 inches thick, like bare feet from yak feet, from tinea, and from ulcers. The troops had assembled on Singapore on the other side of the road to welcome us back didn't say a word. It was like looking at another world. They were booted, they were fleshed, they were probably very thin, but they looked enormous. And we even had a whiff of death about us. And the Sergeant Major pushed us around, our Sergeant Major, lined us up until the bare feet, still separating, were in a perfect line. And then he went to Johnson, who was our Major, and reported that the company was correct. And he went over to Blackjack Galligan and said, "All President correct, sir." And Galligan said, "But where are the rest?" And he said, "They're all here." And that's what it was. We were the last. We lost 310 out of 500 in Thailand.
By nightfall of the 18th of June, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo was over. Perhaps the hardest fought and probably the most decisive, certainly the most dramatic of all battles of black powder warfare. What does the battle tell us about the role of the common soldier, infantryman, gunner, cavalryman? Well, first, that the experience he undergoes has no counterpart anywhere else in human activity. The strains it imposes, the responses it demands, fall outside the common and the everyday. Second, that it can nevertheless be survived, and that chances of survival are improved by training, skill, discipline, and personal courage. But that thirdly, the battlefield is an arena of accident and chance, and no soldier, however brave or disciplined, however skilled in the handling of his weapons, can guarantee to himself his own survival. Those who do survive are set apart from the rest of us, and it is their experience that is the subject of this series. Guns, the essence of military power. Artillery is the god of war, so said Joseph Stalin. Napoleon put it rather differently. It is with artillery, he said, that war is made. But both men were making the same point. It is the big guns that have dominated the battlefield in modern times. Yet the gun has probably changed less than any other weapon of war in the 6 centuries of its existence. Of course, nowadays it's likely to be breech-loaded, made of steel, and frequently with tracks and its own engine. Its ammunition has been revolutionized and its range and accuracy formidably increased. But essentially it remains today what it was in the 14th century. A hollow metal tube, closed at one end, out of which an explosive compound fires a projectile at whatever target a commander chooses. And almost from the start, its impact has been devastating.
The ordeal of living through an artillery bombardment is an experience the survivor never forgets.
I thought at first it wouldn't last very long. I thought that if you had a concentrated bombardment, it would only last for 2 or 3 minutes. But it went on for a couple of hours. And the whole of that time, we heard these shells rushing towards us. They seemed to be feeling a fiendish joy as they were coming to destroy us. After a bit, I just simply waited there, thinking that sooner or later one of them was bound to hit us, and that would be that.
It is a feeling of horror. So all your senses, like hearing and feeling, they are much stronger than in any ordinary position one is in. And also the sound, it howls, and then the crying of the wounded, and also the total helplessness. In a normal battle position, one can shoot back, but here one absolutely can do nothing, only wait, and one hopes that the bombardment will not be too long.
Gunfire need not be incessant to set soldiers' nerves trembling, as the American defenders of Khe Sanh discovered during its siege by the Viet Cong.
The shelling was sporadic, but very effective, because the portion of the hill we occupied, because of its topography, was only about perhaps 50 by 200 meters. And in that area, we had about 400 men. So most any place a shell landed, if the men weren't under cover, we suffered casualties. And these were big rounds. The result was that the average private in the trench could see only his own friends being killed and wounded, his own companions, as it were. The net result was a pretty serious morale problem. He never felt he was getting back, as it were, at the guy who was shooting at him.
Even in small wars, like the Falklands campaign of 1982, when neither side deployed many guns, artillery can still have a deadly impact on morale.
It certainly has a psychological effect, that there is no doubt. I don't think we killed an awful lot in the Falkland Islands, but we certainly took a psychological toll of them to such an extent that they didn't wish to go on. And of course, artillery is not just directed against a soldier eyeball-to-eyeball contact with an enemy. It is often directed against targets in depth. And whilst we fired a lot of artillery in support of the infantry attacking all the hills around Stanley, in very close support, often to within 150 meters of our own forces, the bulk of our effort was devoted to destroying their headquarters, their logistics, and their own gun positions. And I think this is what caused that sudden surrender by the Argentines outside Stanley in 1982.
The European discovery of gunpowder at the beginning of the 14th century launched one of the great technical revolutions of history. Gunpowder released combat from the limitations of muscle power, allowed enemy to strike at enemy over distances greater than could be covered by spear or bow, and transformed siegecraft from a war of nerves to a test of strength. Traditional siege engines had thrown projectiles which hit wherever they fell, but the cannonball could be made to strike accurately and repeatedly at the foundations. The appearance of the new gunpowder weapons outside a besieged city soon came to mean that its fall was at hand. The most spectacular artillery success of the Middle Ages took place at Constantinople, then the largest fortified city in the Western world. In 1453, the Emperor Constantine XI, last of the Caesars, found himself besieged here by the huge army of the Ottoman Turks, under their young Sultan, Mehmed II. These towering walls were the city's principal defense, begun originally by the Emperor Theodosius II 1,000 years before. Studded with towers up to 40 feet high, they stretched 14 miles from the waters of the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. They had shrugged off sieges often before, and they were massive enough to withstand attack by most contemporary artillery. But the artillery park that the Sultan's army now dragged within battering range of the city contained guns bigger and more destructive than any previously brought to the scene of a siege. At the Tower of London, another fortress built before the artillery age, there is a cannon of similar style and power to those that brought the walls of Theodosius tumbling down. It was shipped to London in the 1860s as a gift for Queen Victoria.
There's an ironical twist to this story. The man who designed these great guns was a Hungarian called Urban, who in the first place offered them to the Christians in Constantinople. Only when his services had been rejected as being too expensive did he turn to the Turks. Now, the Turkish Sultan at once recognized what he was being offered, a war-winning weapon of devastating power. The weight of these cannon is quite colossal. The after part here, the breech, weighs nearly 9 tons, and the barrel 8 tons, and there were some that were even heavier. It's said that it took 60 oxen to drag each of Mehmet's cannon towards the walls of Constantinople. There were 200 attendants marching beside them, and another 250 going on ahead to smooth out the roads and strengthen the bridges. This is the kind of shot they would have fired. These gigantic stone cannonballs weigh 1/3 of a ton each, and they could travel up to a mile. "13 giant cannon, firing 4,000 times between April the 1st and May the 10th, 1453, overthrew the patient defensive work of centuries." Soon guns were appearing which in style were to set the pattern for the next 400 years. These, not Mehmet's monsters, were the weapons of the future. Pulled by horses, they could match in speed any marching army. And these were the guns with which Charles VIII of France blitzkrieged Italy in 1495. It was as though the cannon almost immediately found its natural dynamic form. The new guns displayed certain crucial improvements in design. They were now provided with elevating devices, in this case simple wedges, to allow variation of range. Twin projections just in front of the point of balance, called trunnions, allowed the gun to pivot. These were made possible because gun makers had now discovered how to cast the gun in a single piece of bronze. The new artillery of the Renaissance age was so much improved that guns for the first time began to decide the outcome of battle. But the siege remained artillery's main field of action, and siege gunners steadily learnt to perfect their craft. Cannelure, cutting a furrow along a wall's base, was a technique that brought many battlements down. Such techniques were elements in a duel between gunners and siege engineers, which was to be fought through a whole range of wars and campaigns, and which was to last into the present century. It even marked the outbreak of the First World War. And a later 20th century artillery siege took place here in northern France at the opening of the Second World War. This is part of the Maginot Line, the chain of concrete forts built by the French in the 1930s to guard their vulnerable frontier with Germany. Their armored casemates and retractable gun turrets gave these forts the appearance of stranded battleships. They were to prove not much more useful, for the Germans made their main thrust in 1940 far to the north, across the unfortified frontiers of Belgium. But they did mount a few token attacks on the line itself. This fort at La Ferté was one of the targets. The purpose of the attack was partly to keep the French from transferring its garrison to the battle in the north, and partly to let Dr. Goebbels' film crews show the German nation the might of the Wehrmacht. In its pitting of the power of artillery against the strength of fixed defenses, this was an old-fashioned siege, but the weight of firepower the Germans deployed gave the defenders no chance. After a bombardment by guns of all calibers, from medium to super heavy, the German infantry closed in for the final assault.
much like foot soldiers of the Middle Ages storming the breach of a city wall. "210 Frenchmen died in this grisly little confrontation. The battered casemates and toppled cupolas are their memorial. They also commemorate one of the last episodes in a style of war which can be traced back in a direct line to the great set-piece sieges of the medieval world. But while siege gunners pursued their particular speciality, field gunners were making their weapons more directly useful to armies on campaign. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery is here demonstrating this far more significant role of the gun during the last 5 centuries. This is artillery working as one of the essential tools of the general in the field, and showing that it can do so at speed. This may look to us today just colorful ritual, but nothing better demonstrates the nature of the revolution that made artillery a dominant battlefield weapon. Horse artillery provided much color and dash, but it was the heavier field guns which more often brought the action of the day to a decision.
Ready! Fire!
When guns like these fired, the shock of discharge drove them leaping backwards. They had to be manhandled into their old position. They had to be re-aimed at the target by eye between each salvo. Recoil, running up, relaying, reloading. This burdensome sequence demanded much of the gunner's strength and skills.
Fire!
The ordeal the gunners had to endure was as nothing to the carnage they could inflict when their shot drove home into the enemy's massed ranks. Solid round shot, not much bigger than a modern tennis ball, could kill 8 or a dozen men at a time. Disintegrating projectiles, such as canister and grape, took the same toll on men as birdshot on a flight of partridges. As the 19th century drew on, and its satanic mills gave armies guns and shells in massive quantities, artillery spoke with ever greater power on battlefields. On those of the American Civil War, like Gettysburg, it was the guns that decided the issue. And it was the guns which now began to work with terrible effect on landscapes and on cities, the results by now being faithfully recorded by the camera. These images of Confederate strongholds, savaged by artillery and fire, have a very modern look about them. 50 years before Flanders, they are previews of the artillery landscapes of World War I. The design and shape of these projectiles give the clue to the next firepower revolution. Most of them are cast in steel, filled with high explosive and have mechanical fuses. Most important, they have become conical. The reason for that change of shape is explained by a single word: rifling. Late 19th century guns had steel barrels cut with spiral grooves that could keep a conical projectile traveling straight in a way the old smoothbore cannons did not. And there were other refinements. All these guns mark stages in the search for the perfect gun. The problem was how to select the right elements from the current technical ferment. And then, suddenly, one design team got it all together. In 1897, the French Army's artillery workshops at Puteaux produced the world's first truly modern gun. And this is it, the 75mm, known to its gunners as the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Now, all of its features had existed in previous guns, but never before had they been brought together with the same degree of mechanical reliability and efficiency. This gun is as lean, as fast, and as specialized as a Greyhound. For one thing, it was breech loading.
so that no time was wasted ramming the shell down the barrel, and the breech mechanism was designed for rapid and complete opening and closing. Then its shells were propelled by cordite, the new propellant which left much less fouling in the barrel than the old black gunpowder and caused much less smoke on the battlefield. The shells were filled with one of the new generation of high explosives, lyddite, and fitted with a time fuse, accurate to within fractions of a second. Most importantly, the gun was mounted on a hydraulic platform with compressors to absorb the shock of recoil. As a result, the gun no longer needed to be realigned after each discharge. Together, these features gave a quite fantastic rate of fire. French gunners claimed 15 or 20 rounds a minute, which is faster than most soldiers can fire a rifle. It was not long before guns with similar features came into service throughout Europe. The new guns had one other crucial advantage. With their vastly increased range, they could now fire over the hill. It was a major revolution. Previously, gunners could only engage targets they could see. Now, they could fire at targets far out of sight. The French 75mm and similar guns, such as these British 18-pounders, had no sooner been brought into general service than they were called into action in earnest in the First World War. This war's phenomenally destructive character and long duration were largely the result of the recent artillery revolution. It was, above all, a gunner's war. It is part of the mythology of that war that the machine gun was the great killer of infantry. Actually, hospital statistics show that 2/3 of all wounds in all armies were caused by shells. It was gunfire which broke up the mass infantry attacks from the outset, and it was largely gunfire which drove infantry to dig themselves below ground for protection. More, the new powerful artillery produced an entirely different style of gunner's war from the face-to-face battles of the 19th century. With indirect fire, now standard practice, an entirely new role was created, that of the forward observation officer with his signaller far ahead of the guns, identifying targets from often dangerous observation posts.
The most common, of course, was the infantry trench. Then, once in Hebertown, we found a very good observation post from which we could see Goncourt, but it was too dangerous. We should have been killed at once had we been seen. But fortunately, there was a stump of a tree sticking about 6 feet high, left, standing, and a lot of rubble around because it had been very much destroyed. And we decided to call in the camouflage officer, and in one night he had taken away the tree, copied it exactly by camouflage, and arranged a way of entering it through the ground, and then we poked our heads up into this tree and found a little hole and saw all we wanted to see, and the Germans only looked on it as a broken tree. And then, of course, ruined villages, if there's anything left of the houses near the front line, you could invariably climb to the top floor and see through the broken tiles of the roof and that kind of thing. So you took every advantage you could of anything which was higher than ground level.
One particularly dangerous observation post was the air balloon, unconcealable from the enemy and therefore a prime target for his guns or aircraft. Communication with the ground was by direct telephone line, the information being then processed and sent back to the gun batteries. The Royal Flying Corps manned these balloons, and also the aircraft which were used for the same purpose, particularly in the later years of the war. The observer spotted a target on the ground, located it on his map, then transmitted the information acquired by Morse code from a trailing aerial. Once the guns had fired, the airborne observer could signal corrections if the shells were not falling exactly on target. The infantryman was the principal victim of the volcanic bombardments of this war, though if the gunners did their work well, he was also at times the beneficiary.
One lived in a world where there were continuous explosions. Every now and again there would be a loud bang in the distance, rather like Guy Fawkes' Night in England. You see somebody over there was having fireworks. And in this, suddenly the fireworks would break out all around you. But when a real barrage started, it made a continuous roar of thunder that completely drowned and destroyed the casual shell fire of ordinary times. By the end of the war, they were very accurate indeed. The artillery put down the shells exactly where they like, and you actually saw a curtain of shell bursts 200 or 300 yards in front of you, and you went as far as you could. It would certainly silence the enemy and make them keep their heads down, but it might kill them, or it might not. If it hadn't actually killed them, you then had to fight a very frightened German who'd been through a worse experience than you had.
It was artillery that made the landscapes of the First World War, those sloughs of despond and fields of ruin that survivors never forgot. A British Tommy wrote of Ypres,
"Before my eyes spread the martyred city. A concourse of shattered buildings clustered in the middle distance, with here and there a broken chimney stack or a decapitated church spire jutting a little above the rest. The place looked as though it had been left half-finished to the elements. But this was only the superficial appearance of things, for every now and then, here and there, a shell burst among the rubble, demonstrating clearly the cause of the city's dire condition. It seemed a miracle that anyone could survive in that terrible place."
Ypres gave its name to the notorious salient, over which the British and Germans fought uninterruptedly for 4 years. Of the salient, an infantry officer wrote in 1917,
"What confronted us was a lunar landscape of shell craters, one touching another, filled with water and sludgy clay."
Scattered through the salient were zones of special danger, subject to constant bombardment, from which all signs of civilization had been swept away, and through which soldiers always hurried in their eagerness to reach the refuge of less open ground. An American officer wrote,
"This is a cowering war, with men huddled in little holes and caves, praying to escape the blows of giants who pound the earth with blind hammers."
There are still landscapes on the old Western Front which have never recovered from this blind hammering. This is a fragment of the battlefield of Verdun. Here in eastern France in 1916, the French and Germans fought the first pure artillery battle of history. It lasted 10 months. The Germans, who launched the battle, called it Operation Execution Place, and their executioner's tool was the big gun. Their plan was to destroy the French defenders by sheer weight of firepower. But the French defenders refused to be overwhelmed. They repaid the Germans shell for shell, so that the infantry of both armies succumbed to a mutual martyrdom. Men became mere pygmies under the towering rage of these bombardments. Some were blown apart, and no trace of them ever found. Others were piteously mutilated by chunks of flying iron. Dugouts collapsed and buried their garrisons alive. Men were picked up bodily, thrown into trees, slammed against walls, or killed even by the flying fragments of their own comrades' bodies. This was death, but this was death without a shred of human dignity. It was death in mud and squalor and excrement and entrails. Death of men at the mercy of the machine.
vous avez des bombardements effrayants comme vous en aviez, quand les obus vous tombaient dans tous les coins, tout autour, eh bien, vous attendiez le vôtre. Vous attendiez la fin. Ça, c'était une question de... on était terrés complètement. On était dans la terre. On ne savait plus où se fourrer. Et puis, moi, on était là à attendre la dernière minute. C'était l'attente, quoi. Avec la frayeur et tout. Mais ça y est, il y en a quelques-uns qui ont attrapé la dysenterie. Hein. Il y a des morts autour de vous, vous étiez obligés de vivre avec. Il n'y a pas moyen de faire autrement. Parce que les morts, on les enterrait quand on pouvait les enterrer. On en mettait 2, 3 dans le trou, et puis on remettait la terre par-dessus. Mais ils revenaient à nos buts, ils redéterraient les morts. Et puis vous preniez des beefsteaks, comme on dit, de pourriture, de chair pourrie, qui vous arrivait, qui vous en étiez couvert. Des fois, c'était une infection. C'était une infection. L'odeur, c'était quelque chose de terrible.
Also under intense bombardment throughout the battle were Verdun's ring of forts, bastions of defense, which both sides looked upon as specially significant trophies. The most famous was Fort Douaumont, turned by the artillery of both nations into a battered hulk, and still preserved in its wartime state as a memorial to the battle, and as a shrine to those who lost their lives there, many of them permanently entombed in closed-off galleries within the fort. Its machine gun posts and observation points still glower at the landscape across which the enemy attacked in 1916. It's a strange experience to walk through these grim corridors, once occupied by men whose ordeal was every bit as great as that of the infantrymen who cowered on the open ground outside. The French lost the fort to the Germans in the first month of the battle, after which they did everything in their power to win it back. Indeed, Fort Douaumont has been described as the most shelled spot on the surface of the earth. Imagine what it must have been like in these dark and weeping corridors in 1916. Today they're empty, but then they were filled with thousands of war-exhausted, apprehensive men. When the French launched their first attack in May, they brought to bear 300 guns on this fort alone. The air was thick with cordite, the noise so intense men went deaf. One survivor said it was like being inside an enormous drum. In their second attack in October, the French introduced 2 enormous railway guns, whose shells alone weighed 1 ton each. These slammed into the fort with devastating accuracy and precision. Some burst right through the armor and exploded inside. Finally, the German commander, realizing that not even here the lowest levels of the fort were safe anymore, had no option but to require his men to withdraw. It has been estimated that Fort Douaumont claimed the lives of 100,000 men. Many of the French who died there are buried in the vast cemetery that has been constructed nearby. A French officer wrote of those who took part in the Battle of Verdun,
"They will not be able to make us do it again another day. That would be to misconstrue the price of our effort. They will have to resort to men who have not lived out these days."
The iron face of the First World War could not altogether stare down the gunner's jaunty pride in his horsemanship and spectacular panache in bringing his guns into action. No gunner could forget that Napoleon, greatest of generals, had been a gunner, and there were many would-be Napoleons in all armies of the Great War. In the official order of precedence that determines the British Army's hierarchy of regiments and corps, the Royal Horse Artillery, when on parade with guns, takes first place over all others.
The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery forms in such circumstances the British Army's right of the line. Here it is rehearsing on a murky London morning in khaki uniforms scarcely different from those in which it fought at the epics of Neri and Le Cateau in 1914. No great occasion, whether the opening of Parliament, the Queen's birthday, or the visit of some foreign dignitary, is conceivable without the Horse Artillery's distinctive contribution.
Number one!
There are other symbols of the Royal Artillery's corporate pride, glittering trophies of past victories or tokens of gunner piety, brought out from the richest collection owned by any British regiment to decorate the dining table of the Woolwich Mess, the gunners' ancient London home. At the end of the room, the Royal Artillery Band plays throughout the evening. Dinner over and the table cleared, the port circulates in preparation for the drinking of the loyal toast, in a manner unique to the Royal Regiment of Artillery.
All glasses and Evan Chancellor. Thank you very much, Mr. Pink.
Gentlemen, the Queen, our Captain General.
Another tradition is unique to British gunners. The colours they venerate are the guns they serve in battle. Gunners therefore guard their guns with their lives, and in doing so they come to love them as totems of their own identity. Perhaps no gun has attracted as much affection as the 25-pounder, the British Army's standard field gun in the Second World War. The Australians felt the same affection for it, or perhaps a little less when manhandling it over the ridges of the Owen Stanley Range in New Guinea in 1942. The 25-pounder's first great success was in Eritrea, where in 1941 at the Battle of Keren, it helped to rout a well-dug-in Italian army. Keren created an immediate bond between gunners and gun.
It was a weapon that we picked up suddenly, and within 7 days we were using it on the enemy. Now, the 25-pounder was a great gun. It was a wonderful weapon. The story of the gunner is the story of the gun. We towed it around the world, we dragged it, we lived in its service, we supported it, we cleaned it, and when nothing else was left, we reluctantly blew it up. No, there was nothing better than a 25-pounder. Not in my book, anyway. She was a beautiful weapon.
By contrast, there is no worse blow to artillery pride than being overrun by a far more powerful enemy, with the grim choice of either fighting your guns into the ground or destroying them. And this happened in the Western Desert in June 1942 to the same 25-pounder regiment which had fought so superbly in Eritrea. The action has gone into history as the Battle of the Knightsbridge Cauldron.
It's a long time since the Cauldron, but I can still remember quite vividly the shells hitting the gun position, the soft vehicles in the rear going up in flames, the screams of the men on the guns, the smoke and noise, which was pretty terrifying.
The thing that sticks in my mind is this tremendous flash of a gun not very far away, and then this horrific noise of armor-piercing shells flying past, guns, shields being burst to bits, layers collapsing with limbs all over the place and livers falling out of the side, and another man immediately pulling him aside and jumping into the laying seat.
From the time that we were joined the gunners, we were taught that it was a tragedy and a disgrace to spike your gun, but as a last resort, this is the thing you must do. And so on the fourth gun, which is the one that I was firing, I eventually I put a shell in the breech and fired, but the charge was faulty. The tanks were coming in very close. They were something like 50 yards away, and German infantry were advancing on the flanks. And so I could do no more than take out the breech mechanism, which I hid in the slit trench which we had dug during the morning. So I don't think that particular 25-pounder would have been any use to anybody.
Normandy, invaded by the Allies in June 1944, challenged the Allied artillery to find and destroy the German garrison in a landscape ideally suited to defense. And new mobility was part of the answer. While most of the German artillery remained horse-drawn, even the Allies' heavy guns were now mounted on pneumatic-tired carriages pulled by four-wheel drive tractors or big lorries. Moved at speed, they could also be rapidly deployed and brought into action. Some guns had now become armored vehicles, self-propelled pieces, which provided the mechanized units with their artillery support. One of them, the Sexton, mounted the famous 25-pounder on the equally famous Sherman tank chassis. But radio was the greatest step forward in artillery communications. Its universal adoption freed gunners from depending on vulnerable telephone cables. The nerve center of the system was here, in the artillery command post, where fire orders were worked out from target information received. It came from a variety of sources. From air observation post officers circling the battlefield in Oster spotter aircraft. From sound-ranging microphones buried in the earth that could plot an enemy's gun position to within 15 yards. And from artillerymen out forward with the infantry. As the infantry advanced, so too did the forward observers, keeping in constant touch with the gunner command posts through their man-pack radios. Target information collected by the radio network allowed the command post officer to orchestrate the mass of guns at his disposal into a whirlwind of fire. Russian soldiers have long been devotees of artillery. In World War II, they fielded more guns than any other army. Here, Stalin's god of war celebrates a Soviet triumph. The Red Army pushed to extremes the technique of massing artillery on a chosen front of attack for an overwhelming preliminary bombardment. The aim was to eliminate all resistance and then rush a torrent of tanks and infantry through the gap in the enemy line. These tempests of gunnery underlay the Russian victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. But different campaigns, as always in history, produce different techniques. In Vietnam, set-piece bombardments were quite inappropriate to the fluid, will-o'-the-wisp fighting.
What the artillery did provide to the infantry and the other maneuver forces was the same thing that it has provided since time immemorial, and that is simply that we provided a big morale boost to the infantry types. Whenever the infantry would be held up by perhaps only one or two enemy soldiers shooting at them with small arms, rather than continue to be held up and taking any unnecessary casualties, the first thing that the infantry would think of is, where's the artillery? And in several instances, this was artillery used in a direct fire role against a house or some other structure. And we would fire the weapon, and the building and its inhabitants would be destroyed, allowing the infantry to move on and continue with their operation. in one of the units to which I was assigned, our mission was to provide fire support to a reconnaissance insert. This would be a group of infantry types who would be inserted a fair distance from an operational base, primarily to collect information on enemy movements. They were out there in small numbers, very limited self-defense capability on their own. So what they had to rely upon and what gave them that morale boost was the artillery. We were there come rain or shine, unlike Air Force assets that in some cases could not fly. We were always there, and we were their security blanket, if you will.
In all the mechanized armies that garrison NATO's Central Front in Germany in the 1980s, artillery has been completely integrated into the pattern of high-speed armored operations for which NATO forces train. This, here in service with the British Army, is the American-built M110, conceived on the same principle as the Sexton of World War II, but far more mobile, and mounting the nuclear-capable 210mm howitzer. This is the M109, an American-built 155mm howitzer, also used by the British Army. The men manning this vehicle might be the crew of a naval gun turret. Certainly the techniques of laying and loading are the same as those of gunnery at Jutland and Leyte Gulf. But the power the gun packs, it too is nuclear capable, makes it a weapon of the future rather than the past. It belongs to a trend that makes artillery a more formidable battlefield weapon than ever before.
I think that probably the 1980s are the most exciting time that the field artillery has ever had since the turn of the century. And this gets back to when we first had indirect fires with the French 75 that all of us used in World War I. Today, we're in an era where technology has given us the microchip. And the electronic industry has added precision to our communications, to our guidance, to the entire way that we operate.
Squat's good. Send it down.
Long gone is the time where we are depending upon the human eyesight to acquire targets with a forward observer that would be with the infantryman or the tanker. We still use him, but he has enhanced optics, night vision devices, and etc. But more importantly, we have counter-battery radars that can look 30 to 40 kilometers deep into the enemy's rear to detect artillery firing at us. In addition, the remotely piloted vehicle that the Israelis used in Lebanon is an example of the technology we're working with. And again, satellites. Satellites are of course, used in the strategic sense, but all of the technology that we have certainly will allow us to use satellites in the tactical battle and not just the strategic battle. So I think those things will provide us overabundance of artillery targets. And all we have to do is have the munitions and the wherewithal to attack them.
This is the kind of wherewithal now available, the MLRS, or Multiple Launch Rocket System. Derived from a Russian design of the Second World War, it concentrates the firepower of 18 orthodox artillery systems into a single unit. Its crew of 3 can bring it to its firing point, launch all its rockets, and be off again in less than a minute. The MLRS perpetuates and extends the timeless roles of artillery in war.
In battle, the artillery has always had 2 roles. In defense, its purpose is to destroy the impetus of the enemy's attacks. And in attack, its task is to destroy the enemy's will to resist. Just that. And whether you consider the medieval wars, or the Napoleonic wars, or the great wars that followed them, those 2 tasks have remained. And whether you think about missiles with homing heads, or shells that can find their own way to the target, or any of the other emerging technologies, those 2 tasks still remain, and there is no other arm on the battlefield that can perform them. But today, in fact, we are thinking less about battles than about deterring war as a whole. And in that context, too, the formidable power of the artillery, its destructive effect, and what I can only call the authority of the guns, represent one of the most effective deterrents of them all.
For the future, for years now, artillery has had this kind of ultimate power. This is an atomic cannon of 30 years ago. The power of its equivalent 30 years hence is unimaginable. Meanwhile, conventional artillery continues to grow in mobility, rate of fire, range, precision, destructive power, making battlefields more and more dangerous for the human being to inhabit. But artillery now threatens to carry its power beyond the battlefield, and perhaps to put the future of the world into the barrel of a gun. It is with artillery, said Napoleon, that war is made. Would he today, contemplating how the weapon he valued so highly has grown to overawe its creators, feel that war should not be made at all?